Got a pop quiz for you, all right? In the spirit of school coming up and everything getting started, just want to let everybody get into it. We've done these before, and I'm not a hard teacher, all right? Okay, here it is. The 3 questions, simply. If you had to choose between sleeping on a Tempur-Pedic body foam mattress and a set of box springs, which would you choose? Tempur-Pedic. All right, see? You're doing well. Second question, all right? If you were going for a long walk, which would you choose? Your favorite tennis shoes or a pair of wooden clogs? Tennis shoes, all right. Third question, this is the last question, just in case you're getting anxious about things. If you had the choice between spending a free weekend at some exotic spa resort or camping out in the Everglades without a tent this week, which would you choose? The spa. Okay. Now, whether you realize it or not, all 3 of those questions have a common denominator. And that common denominator is something that we cherish a lot, and that's called comfort. We like comfort, don't we? It has a high value in our country. There are even TV shows that we watch, and we think, boy, I'm glad I don't have to do that. You ever seen the show Dirty Jobs with Mike Wolf, I believe is the guy's name. If you've never seen it, he goes and he finds all these nasty jobs. People send in and say, this is a dirty job, and he goes and does that job. There's 2 that I can remember that stand out. One was that he went to this place where they had these big locks, like where they lock for a dam or a channel or a river is going through. And the job was to actually get down inside those big steel walls and clean them out of all the sludge and stuff like that was in there. First off, it makes me claustrophobic. Just think about getting down inside there, and who knows what they're going to find when he gets down in there. So that was one. The other one was this in Las Vegas. This guy had created this business where he contracted with all of the casinos and all the places that produced food and things. He would collect their scraps, their garbage, and he'd take all that slop basically out to his farm and run it through a process, and he would create food not for people. I know that's what you're thinking, animal food like for hogs and cows and things like that. But from point A to final product was not a pretty job. It was pretty messy along the way. And he would always, Bear Grylls, he has a lot of different shows. Probably the one that made him the most was Man vs. Wild, where he had to go out in the wilderness and live for, however long and eat all this stuff. And now he has one called Running Wild, I think what it is. And he takes the people from Hollywood, celebrities, whoever, and he spends a couple days with them. And usually the part you look forward to the most in one of his shows is where he decides he's going to have to eat off the land, all right? And he's usually, eating worms or scorpions or some type of gross thing that you're thinking, man, I'm glad I'm sitting here munching my popcorn rather than having to eat the things that he's eating. It doesn't look like a really comfortable situation to be in. Well, we love comfort. But there's a danger in loving comfort too much. What I mean by that is sometimes our faith can adapt this concept that I want to be comfortable all the time in my faith. Even in some of the most basic things. We walk into the church, a climate-controlled church building. In the winter, it's heated to just the right temperature. Even in the Florida sunshine, sometimes you have to kick the heat on. In the summertime, of course, most of the year here, it's cooled at just the right temperature. And if it's 1 or 2 degrees off, you tell someone about it, all right? How do I know? Because I'm sometimes the one that gets told. We have that comfort zone. We like that in that certain area. We come in and we have the padded pews, and we're very thankful for the padded chairs that we have. And we like that comfort. Even our Bibles are many times soft, leather-bound Bibles, comfortable in the hands, easy to hold. In some churches, unfortunately, even the messages become padded. They don't want to challenge you too much or cause you to have to change much. We're just going to make you just feel good and happy and go on with life. What's interesting is you look at the life of Jesus. He didn't seem too concerned about comfort. Our theme verse for this sermon series, not a fan. Are you a fan or follower of Jesus? We've been sharing it each week. Hopefully we become familiar with it. Once again, Luke chapter 9, verse 23, Jesus says these words. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. We've looked at different aspects of that verse, and today I want to focus on one of those words that if you were to take this word out, it wouldn't mean all that much, and it is the cross. Take up the cross daily. You see, the cross is pretty central in Christianity, isn't it? We have been using the question, are you a follower or are you a fan of Jesus? And if we're not careful, it's easy to become a fan, and we like to make the cross comfortable. It becomes a decoration on the wall, which we have. It becomes something that we might wear around our necks and have on jewelry. It's something that we have made attractive. But I want us to jump back about 2,000 years. And if you're standing there, you're sitting there, and you hear Jesus utter those words, take up your cross, at that point, all of a sudden, whoa, what's he talking about? That would have been the strangest, scariest thing that they could have heard. First, I just want us to look at what the cross meant in the days of Jesus. In the days of the early church. The Apostle Paul understood there was this conflict, this struggle that people had with the cross. What was the big deal about the cross? He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 20 through 25. He says, the Jews demand miraculous signs, and the Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. A stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. When those people there that day heard Jesus utter those words, a cross did not bring positive images in their life. It did not cause them to think, oh yeah, that's something I would really love to be a part of. No, a cross to the Greek and Gentile mind, image of crucifixion immediately came to their mind. A cruel, cruel way of being executed. It, to the Greek mind, was simply a sign of shame, disgrace, weakness. You see, the Greeks, they elevated learning and virtue. Those were the things that would bring you to wisdom. The more you could understand about the world, and the more you could understand about the thoughts of man, and the more you could philosophize about all those things, that's what brought strength. That's brought wisdom. Certainly not a cross. That was shame, disgrace. The Roman government had issued that form of execution for many years, and that would have been the first thing they thought of. What about the Jews? Well, they too would have been very aware of what the Romans did with the crucifixion, or that whole concept. But they even went a step further than that, because in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23, it talks about if anyone would die upon a tree, they would be cursed by God. So the Jews, they would hear that, and they would think of the crucifixion, and they would think, how in the world could the Messiah, one sent by God, be crucified on a tree, because the Old Testament said that that person was cursed by God, and they couldn't get beyond that. So when we hear Jesus say those words, it's not that big a deal to us, because we're comfortable with the cross. It's been around for a long time. We understand it. We understand what. But the days of Jesus and the early church, when they heard someone talk about, you need to worship this man who was crucified on a cross. And when Jesus says, take up your cross daily, it would have been repulsive to those who heard those words. In verse 18, Paul says there in 1 Corinthians, he says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. So reflect on the cross. And I think it's important for us to understand what God did with the cross. What God did to the cross was really pretty amazing. He took something that from a human standpoint they saw as foolishness. Saw something that had no glory, no redeeming value whatsoever. And he said, that's what I'll use. That's what I'll take. That's what will make a difference. See, who else but God could take something that represented defeat and turn it into a symbol of victory? Who else but God could take something which represented guilt and turn it into a symbol of grace? Who else but God could take something that represented pain and turn it into something that represented healing and hope? Who else but God could take something that screamed death and turn it into a symbol of life? No one else but God. And Jesus said, I want you to take up your cross daily. Take up your cross daily. What seems to be the ultimate moment of weakness in the eyes of man, when Jesus Christ died on the cross, became the ultimate symbol and demonstration of God's victory. How does that work? The Bible doesn't speak of this, but have you ever wondered what Satan and his angels were doing when the crucifixion was going on? I think they were having a party. All right, look what we've done. High-fiving everybody. Going around, finally, we've done it. We have killed the Son of God. And we think, why did that have to happen? Well, what I believe that Satan didn't see beyond was that without the death on the cross, there would be no resurrection. I don't know if any of you have ever read C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia or seen the movies, but it's a Christian allegory. And there's a scene at the end of the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia where Aslan, the great lion who was the Messiah that Narnia represented Christ. And they had finally accomplished the evil forces. They had finally put Aslan on the altar and they cut him to pieces. They slayed him. And all the evil forces there of Narnia, they were celebrating because they had achieved victory. Yet 3 days later, Aslan came back and they were mighty surprised. What God did with the cross, here's a pretty amazing thing to think about. And if you haven't heard anything else, if you've been asleep, now's the time to wake up. Because here's the one thing that you need to take home today. What God did for the cross, He does for you and I. When you're at your weakest, then God becomes strong. You see, the upside down truth of the cross is that when we are weak, then He is strong. On down to verse 27 of chapter 1 there in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. You see, it's not that God used the cross in spite of its weakness. He chose the cross because of its weakness. And when people would look at the cross, they could not imagine how in the world anything good could come out of that. And yet God continually chooses the weak in order to be strong. Throughout Scriptures, think about it. Throughout Scriptures, He uses imperfect, weak people to do some pretty amazing things. Just listen to this list. Abraham was old. Jacob was insecure. Leah was unattractive. Joseph was mistreated. Moses stuttered. Gideon was afraid. Samson was proud. Rahab was immoral. David had an affair. Elijah was suicidal. Jeremiah was depressed. Jonah was disobedient. Naomi was a widow. John the Baptist was eccentric. Peter was impulsive and hot-tempered. Martha worried a lot. The Samaritan woman had 5 failed marriages. Zacchaeus was unpopular. Thomas had doubts. Paul had poor health. Timothy was timid. And the list can go on and on and on and on. Why? Because God chose imperfect weakness in the lives of people to do some pretty amazing things. And I don't know about you, but I am thankful for that. Because as I look at my own life, and my guess is if you would look at yours, you just might find 1 or 2 weaknesses that might pop up. So our prayer needs to be, God, do for me what you did with the cross. Though it seems backward to us, it doesn't make sense. In our weakness, He becomes strong. Paul talks about this more in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 when he says these words. He says, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." Therefore, and that's a quote from the Old Testament, and then he says, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." That's the Apostle Paul. He's the guy that went around and he was stoned, he was beaten, he was dragged to prison, he was shipwrecked, he did all of those things, and he did some pretty amazing things for the kingdom, established most of the known churches in the known world at that time. He wrote over half the books of the New Testament. And Paul says, "I am thankful for my weakness. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Now, I don't know too many people that just naturally delight in their weakness. You ever gone to a job interview? And in the job interview, they say, "Now, what are your skills? What do you enjoy?" And then then the question always usually comes, "All right, what are your weaknesses?" You hate that question. If you want to get hired, you don't say, "Well, I don't always show up to work on time, and I really don't even know how to turn on a computer, and I like to put things off a lot, and I like to take a lot of breaks during the workday. Is all that okay? Those are some of my weaknesses." No, you don't do that. If you want to be hired, you don't just say. What you do, you find some good phrases that sounds like weaknesses, but really they're not. Like, "Well, I guess if I had any flaw, I'm just a perfectionist. I want to make sure everything is done, and that sometimes that's just a little bit too much." Or, "Well, I guess I just expect too much of people. I want the job to be done right the first time and be done well, and that really irritates me when the job is." We like to make our weaknesses sound like strengths, but if we're honest, as weakness are weaknesses, and that's what they are. There's no getting around them. Paul said, "When I am weak, then I am strong." Paul says that strength comes when we realize our weaknesses, when we're really willing to give in to them and surrender them. I want to read a little description, and you've probably experienced something like this or seen this. It's a father describing a scene that he had with one of his children on vacation. He says, when we were traveling over spring break, my son had packed some toys and books into a backpack, and instead of hauling that thing, and insisted on hauling that thing around himself. I volunteered several times to carry it, but he wanted to do it himself. It was clear that he wanted us to notice and point out how strong he was. We came to that conclusion when he would say to us repeatedly, "Look how strong I am." But on one occasion, we parked in a hotel parking lot late at night, and we weren't very close to the entrance, and I knew Cale was tired, and he started off strong, but soon was struggling. With a heavy sigh, he stopped, and he didn't really say anything. He just turned around, looked up at me, dropped his backpack to the ground. I picked it up, put it over my shoulder. We walked a few more steps. He stopped again. Another heavy sigh. This time he reached up, and I scooped him up in my arms. I was happy to carry not only my son's weight, but also his burden. You ever seen that? The child is willing to admit, Heather, when she was a little girl, when we lived in Springfield, we'd be out somewhere and she'd fall asleep in the back seat. And when we get home, she'd fall into this deeper sleep. She just couldn't wake up to be carried inside because she wanted her daddy to pick her up and carry her inside. I soon wised up to this when she got bigger. When Jesus said, "Deny yourself, take up my cross daily, and follow me," he was asking us to be willing to surrender and say, "I need your strength. I can't do this on my own." We need to admit our weaknesses and let God's strength take its place. We need to let God do what He did with the cross to our own lives. For us to be followers and not just fans, our prayer needs to be simply this: God, do in me what you did in the cross. God, do in me what you did in the cross. God, do in me what you did in the cross. Let that be your prayer and mine. Let's pray.